hear me back there, though, right? All right. And then are there any attorneys in the room? Other than me? No? Oh, I can tell you guys the truth. This is going to be awesome. All right. So, wanted to do this because I think that people in the information technology field are at certain risk. It could be legal risk, could be regulatory risk, it could be your organizations, or it could be us in our individual capacities for what we do. And it's not because we're doing anything intentionally, it's we're doing our jobs, and there's just too much uncertainty in the legal and regulatory fields. Not without good reason, but for certain reasons we'll get into today. But we're at some risk, and we need to figure out what that risk is so that we can play the percentages a little bit better. We can't get to everything today. I looked at my slides yesterday and I said, I could have replaced everything and talked about completely different subjects. Still wouldn't have scratched the surface. Even for the topics we're discussing today, there are other aspects of them that could have taken up this entire period. So there's a lot going on and a lot developing quickly, just as it is for everything in technology. So we'll scratch the surface today, but hopefully what we'll do is at least give you a way to think about some of the issues that are coming up and how to play the percentages to reduce our risk. On my bio slide, there's a bunch of things on it about, I was in the Marine Corps for 23 years, had somewhat ordinary legal career at first, but really the slide reads, blah, 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 Cyber Command. Retired in 2022, got to do a whole bunch of cool things at Cyber Command. If any of you are thinking of joining the military or the IT community, I would love to talk about it with you and highly encourage it. If any of you are thinking of going to law school, is anyone doing that or willing to admit it? Yeah, I won't try and talk you out of it, but I will give you a couple warnings if you are thinking about it. But if the slides do come up, my contact information is on there, and if you ever need advice on anything, what you're thinking about with your careers especially, I'm happy to help. So we'll discuss the developments that might affect the people in this room. Have y'all heard, everyone in here heard of the SolarWinds incident and aware of the SEC action, Security and Exchange Commission? Okay, we'll talk about it a little bit. The NIST cybersecurity framework, everybody's heard of that? It looks like a bunch of yeses. New developments regarding that. Volt Typhoon, everyone familiar with the Chinese threat actor group that is doing a number of different things to put America at risk. We'll talk about that as well. And then everyone's heard of artificial intelligence, right? No? You know, I was trying to stay out of it, but you can't. This guy, he's CISO for the state of Connecticut. He said if you put it off for 6 months, you're just going to be 6 months behind everybody who's investing time in it. So unfortunately, I got in it. There's a lot of legal issues coming up in that regard. So we'll talk about it real briefly. Hopefully we'll get to questions. We started a little bit late, but I'll try and cut it short, go fast through the issues. But the main thing here is to help everyone spot issues early. That is a cost-effective way of dealing with issues, spotting them before they turn into crises. So not only for the types of topics we're talking about today, but also for the way to think about crises that come up. Hopefully we'll come away with something from this. So to set the stage with some things that you might have heard before or might have heard 1,000 times before, we all know technology is evolving faster than society can keep up, faster than lawmakers can keep up, faster than lawyers can keep up, faster than just about anyone can keep up. And so the rules are behind, if there should be rules at all for some of these technologies, but we're just not digesting them fast enough to deal with them in the way that society would want to. Other thing to note is that laws and regulations can shape this field more than it can others' field just by the nature of the domain. Think about, we have speed limits on the highway that limit how fast cars can go, but I'm going to guess most of the people in this room, to include myself, went above the speed limit on the way here at some point. Did you? Okay, all right. Well, you know, so the law is not restraining us, but if we were in cyberspace, certain rules could be put into the domain that would limit the speed at which information moves. So the best example of this I ever heard was written in the year 2000 by a gent named Lawrence Lessig, who's a professor at Harvard. Highly recommend anything that he's written about cyberspace. What he said was, you don't need a rule or you don't need a law to prevent skyscrapers from being stolen. But you do need a rule for automobiles, or a law for automobiles to prevent them from being stolen. That's just because of the physics of skyscrapers and automobiles. Cyberspace makes the impossible, or the once impossible, possible or much easier. So there may need to be new laws, new rules to reevaluate how those new possibilities might affect the world. One other thing to set the stage is that laws and regulations in our space are going to create winners and losers. It costs money to comply with regulations. It costs money not only to comply, but to demonstrate compliance. When there is a regulator that you're going to have to answer to in DC, no matter where you are, when you're dealing with an incident that's going to be reportable, it's like having that regulator in the room, because you're not only going to be answering to your bosses in your organization, but also to that regulator, and that costs money. To the extent that you can make a compliant system and demonstrate compliance before an incident, you're going to reduce your costs significantly. I know a lot of folks in this space, they put off thinking about that crisis because it's not cost effective in the beginning, and you always have the chance that the crisis is never going to arise. But there is a risk that comes attached with that. Not that it's not understandable, but there's a risk that comes attached with not preparing for the crisis, and that is greater costs later on. One thing to set the stage about the rulemaking environment, we have ourselves who can make the rules. It could be the organizations that say, okay, we're going to use this technology for this, even if it's possible to do certain things. We're only going to let it do a certain specified number of things, so we can regulate ourselves. That's usually dictated by the market. It's dictated by money. So we tend to regulate ourselves in accordance with the rewards we're seeking. Congress has not been able to make widespread law to implement required cybersecurity across the board. Not without good reason. There is political dysfunction, as we all know. The latest Congress has created less laws than most, and definitely most in recent times. But in this category in particular, I think they are just as befuddled, and some of them are of a generation or are from communities that don't understand this space very well. And there is political risk and a lot of money behind keeping things the way they are. So I don't really fault Congress for not coming up with the best system, although I read yesterday that something has advanced with regard to a federal data privacy law, which might make things easier and less costly, because you then have to comply with one data privacy law, well, one in the United States. International is a different story, but one in the US instead of 50 across the 50 states plus territories in DC. So don't blame Congress. They do understand the problem, but it is a difficult one for all of us to handle, including them. Because Congress doesn't make rules or doesn't make laws to address these issues, federal regulators take it upon themselves to make rules for different communities to fulfill. They don't have the same powers as Congress does. Unless they have a enumerated power to regulate a certain industry, they can't regulate it. Recently, there has been a reevaluation of the regulatory field in its entirety. The Supreme Court just took up a case where basically what the regulatory regime is right now is that if Congress hasn't said you can't do something to the regulators, then they're probably able to do it if it's within the scope of their mandate. Now what Congress is considering is that they're going to have something more specific to enable their powers. So if they're going to make a rule in a certain category, certainly in fields where cybersecurity hasn't traditionally been where they regulated, they would potentially not be able to regulate in that area. Is everyone familiar with we're going to talk about it later, but everyone familiar with what's happened with the Environmental Protection Agency and their efforts to regulate water utilities? Yeah, we'll discuss a little bit, but that's a good example of where U.S. regulators can't fill in where the law can't either. And then you have all those states, international, and even private standards, associations, international and U.S.-based associations of different industries that have standards, most of which are voluntary. The state laws are not. Some of the international laws aren't, even for countries that are organizations that work solely in this country. But there are a whole bunch of different standards that the IT community might be expected to live up to. So, first topic that's given us trouble. SEC, the Security Exchange Commission, and SolarWinds. SolarWinds, a publicly traded company, software company, that makes products that hopefully make the rest of IT compliance easier, or IT activities easier. They have tens of thousands of clients, to include the federal government. In late 2020, it was revealed that one of their products had been compromised by Russian actors. And when their product was compromised and they sent an update, thousands of their customers got compromised as well. And there were access into all these organizations that weren't properly prepared for that type of threat. Last year, the SEC filed a civil action against SolarWinds and by name against the Chief Information Security Officer, and said that they had both implemented poor cybersecurity practices, but perhaps more importantly, had made false statements regarding their cybersecurity. This is important for a public company because when you buy a share of a stock these days, you're not buying just what the company does and what its profit potential is, but you're also becoming a partner in their risk. Because as we all know, some of these risks are existential, so no matter how great a company's product is, if their cybersecurity is poor and their systems go down, or if the Chinese steal their intellectual property, and Chinese are probably listening. Hello, how are you? We'll find you someday. Anyway, that's the end of the company potentially, or certainly in the shape that it is at the moment that breach happens. So the SEC wants to know about these things because they're going to affect, they're protecting the stockholders, right? And they want to protect that share price from, or they want included in the share price the risk of a cybersecurity incident in that organization. So the misleading statements were maybe the bigger deal. I think it's going to be hard for the government to demonstrate that harder at least, to demonstrate that SolarWinds had poor cybersecurity practices because the standards are still all over the place. The false statements, though, may give them more trouble. The lesson learned out of SolarWinds for CISOs and everybody in the IT community is particularly one with regard to communication. One of the big SEC complaints was that the communications inside the organization were much different than the communications that were going to customers, shareholders, and the SEC. There were insider acknowledgments that cybersecurity was poor, but outside statements that it was just fine. And that, of course, is something that would have affected the share price of SolarWinds. So a whole number of CISOs, and I know there's a couple in here, and maybe you did it yourselves, but I'm guessing that a number of CISOs went back when they saw this complaint against this SolarWinds CISO and read all their emails for the past couple of years to see what they had said internally. Is it possible? Because they're going to be, well, at least in the SolarWinds case, the CISO is being held accountable for them and comparing them to the public statements. So that's something to keep in mind going forward. And that's not just your statements, leadership statements, but also those of everyone in the organization that has something to do with the IT systems that you're working on. What you would want, ideally, is to have consistency of messaging. You'd want to address the questions of your IT workers. If they're challenging something, if they're alerting you to something, you'd want them to get the right message. You'd want to engage them so that if somebody looks at those discussions later on, you can demonstrate that you took these warnings seriously and did something about them. This is potentially going to radically change the CISO's job and the entire organization's within that organization's function, because I would imagine that can become a full-time job, merely the communication. You've also got to find a way to get the attention of your CEO when only the CEO is the one who can influence the organization in the way that it needs to move, because the CEO obviously is more empowered than anybody else in the organization. You got to have transparency with your different communities as well. These things that might come up from the rank and file, the problems that they identify, you may not be able to address them all, but you at least want to acknowledge them. And what you mostly want to do is be able to give a reason why some things were prioritized and others weren't. It's probably the safest way to cover yourself as a CISO. And underlying all that is keeping good records, which again I understand is potentially going to become a good portion of a CISO's day if they're thinking about demonstrating what happened that day to a regulator 3, 4, 5 years down the road, or even more. I don't. Yeah. Yeah. So we could spend the rest of it, or actually we could go back to the beginning and spend the whole time on this question alone. There's a number of risks. You're talking about transparency before the incident, but there's also the issue of transparency after the incident. The problem, I think, before the incident is that there was a lexicon, a vernacular that became very quickly the acceptable language between the government and CISOs or those making filings that related to cybersecurity issues. And that was pretty boilerplate. Everyone knows what I mean by that. It was just everybody was saying the same thing or something similar, and it didn't reveal too much information. And apparently the government didn't object too much to that. I think one of the interesting things that's going to come out of this case is that that boilerplate is going to be put to the test, and I think the government is at least somewhat at fault by not objecting to it. Not to mention the fact, and this goes across the board for every cybersecurity issue, that the government was the one who developed the internet in the first place, or at least the one we're working on, and are partially at least, and legally, maybe morally, definitely responsible for some of the vulnerabilities that all of us face today. They're the ones who created the system to be as open as it is. They didn't anticipate everything, but I don't know. I would love to discuss that with anyone who sees that a different way. But let me just finish this one, and I'll get to you. There's going to be a level of transparency that's required coming out of this case. Whether it still looks like boilerplate or it has to be something more specific to an organization's situation, I don't know yet. But I would imagine that it's going to have to be something more specific than what's gone on to date. And I don't know if anyone in this room has adjusted anything because of the SolarWinds case, but I'm imagining that some folks are taking the complaint as a roadmap and using it to guide what communications they have going forward. Yes, sir.
I just want to comment that as a CISO, I would never speak in absolute. Somebody asked me, are you secure? I would refer to my last external audit and according to my own maturity model. I would never say we're secure. Have you ever been breached? To the best of my knowledge, we haven't. Don't ever talk in absolute.
Are you sure you didn't go to law school? You're welcome to come on. But yeah, no, that's what I would encourage as well. Yeah. Well, you remember it well. Yes, sir.
Kurt, one of the things I was concerned about looking at the SolarWinds case was, the SEC around the same time was talking about whether or not you had to, they're making decisions about what to require in terms of cybersecurity on boards of directors, and that there was some sentiment that there may be things like the Caremark principle building software, therefore you should build secure software. I thought that the judgment in SolarWinds kind of sent the wrong message to the board of directors that somehow, hey, we'll just go find someone within the link and file management team to go after, and somehow it kind of abdicates the board of their responsibility for cybersecurity. You have a different perspective on that?
I think it goes back to what I was saying about Congress. I don't think the government has the expertise to give clearer guidance. That's another issue I'd love to discuss if anyone disagrees with it. But I don't think they can do a Sarbanes-Oxley. Sarbanes-Oxley gives certain accounting requirements for publicly traded organizations, right? And there could be something like that developed for cybersecurity, but I just don't think people know accounting in the government. They don't know cybersecurity. Back to your question, though, about boards, and I don't think I'm going to be able to cover all of it, but boards, they're covering their cybersecurity responsibilities in two ways. They're getting folks on the board that have expertise, or they're potentially creating panels or cybersecurity advisory boards that help them fulfill their requirements for having access to expertise. Don't know what's going to be required of them as a standard. Caremark, not sure that that's going to be the standard for cybersecurity anyway. But it's another one of those things where I just think there's just too much uncertainty out there, which is what the law and regulations are supposed to do, is give us all certainty into how to conduct our lives without getting in trouble. Something back here on the aisle? Yes, ma'am? Yeah, and some of it has to be guided by realities, right? You leave laws a little bit vague. I mean, you want them to be certain enough that we can follow them, but you also want them to be vague enough that, or flexible enough that they can withstand new developments. My issue with the way that government is handling things right now is that they're leaving it too vague. Um, Yeah, and so some organizations are over-reporting, which not only, pardon me, not only absorbs their time, but absorbs the government's time, and now you've created this pile of needles in which you're going to throw the one report that is a worthwhile one on top of, and we don't know if the government's going to be able to find it or respond to it or distinguish it from all the other ones that don't matter as much. Let me move on to the next topic, because we could talk about this one. We've only got 13 minutes left anyway. But so for NIST, CSF, and the FCC Internet of Things Labeling Program, everyone knows NIST, CSF, right? The cybersecurity framework. All right, the FCC Internet of Things labeling program. Everyone familiar with that? Yes, sir? We're not, yeah, unfortunately, I didn't come up, but I will get them to you, and I'm going to find a way to make up for some of the stuff we're not going to get to today. And you gave up your Saturdays to see this. I want you to get all of it. I'm going to find a way to get it to you. Yeah, the labeling program is basically going to be a brand that the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, is going to put on certain products meeting certain cybersecurity standards. Basically, for both of these things, they are not required. They are voluntary. However, they may create standards that we all have to live by, whether we volunteer to participate in them or not. Because one, if you do volunteer to participate, you are basically committing yourself to those standards. If you don't, there's still going to be standards that courts and regulators and others, with contract actions even, are going to ask, have you conducted your cybersecurity program in a reasonable manner? That's kind of what when there's nothing else to guide you, that's what the legal question is going to be. And so these things may become the reasonable standard, not because they represent actual good practices, but it's because it's the name that everybody knows. So that's one thing to look out for as these standards develop, that you may be beholden to them even if you're not following them. One different path that's developing right now is that water utilities, I was talking earlier about the EPA, they tried to regulate it. Cybersecurity for water utilities, wastewater utilities. A number of these companies objected, and then the EPA was sued by a number of state attorney generals. And basically, in the face of that litigation, the EPA withdrew the rule and issued voluntary guidance instead. What's developing now potentially is that the water utility industry is going to create an organization where they create their own standards. I understand they do this in the electricity industry, which I'm not as familiar with, their cybersecurity practices, but this is another thing that may develop that may be promising because there's going to be more expertise available. That organization, although it may be private, it's going to be in close touch with the EPA, so you may be satisfying, or they may be incorporating what are the EPA's expectations. But then you also have a bunch of experts that are in industry that are also going to be the ones not only who create the rules, but are going to have to comply with them. So hopefully they would come up with a better system. Whatever standard they come up with may set the example for other industries as well. There are a number of other benchmarks that we could look towards from the European Union, from other federal organizations, DHS, CISA, whatever your sector risk management agency is. If you're in a regulated industry, chances are your regulator, no matter what their level of cybersecurity expertise is going to be setting standards for that industry. And you may end up being beholden to a number of different standards by virtue of where you sit. If you're in transportation, you're part of critical infrastructure, you're part of the transportation industry, critical infrastructure. There may be multiple standards that they have. Organizations are objecting to this because it will be costly and probably needlessly so. So there will be some changes from what the government is expecting in this role. All right. One thing that I hope is a remote possibility, but I think we all need to be aware of, is the law of armed conflict and information technology professionals. Your head just snapped up. And it is something we need to worry about because of what's at stake. So we're getting lessons learned out of the Ukraine conflict right now that is the first armed conflict that includes both kinetic activity, violent physical activity, with large-scale cyber operations being conducted by both sides. And what we're seeing is the possibility that, well, first of all, I should say, the rule for the law of armed conflict is that civilians can't be targeted. However, they can lose their protection as civilians, as non-combatants, by taking part in certain activities. The standard is, are you directly participating in hostilities? And that doesn't mean just, are you a trigger puller? Are you as a civilian dressed like this, you pull out or you grab somebody's rifle and you start shooting, you are directly participating in hostilities. But it includes other things. If you are a lookout that is pointing and you don't have a weapon, you're pointing where troops are going that are attacking, that potentially makes you, there's arguments from the International Committee of the Red Cross and the militaries of certain nations on how to handle these things. But basically, there is a way a civilian can lose their protection. One of the things that's come up because of the Ukraine conflict is that we're seeing more and more folks involved who either intentionally or unintentionally are influencing what's going on in Ukraine with regard to the armed conflict. Where an information technology professional might be crossing the line into directly participating in hostilities, we don't know yet. Is it merely supporting the networks that support the government, like you're just handling the EPA of Ukraine or their Department of Transportation? If you're supporting their networks, would that be crossing the line? Probably not. If you are enabling the networks that enable their military operations, possibly. If you are turning off the lights in a target area while someone else in the military is running a raid using violence, you probably are participating in hostilities. I would imagine those folks are few and far between, but for the Microsofts and the Apples and anybody else that is in some way supporting one side or the other and their networks, there is a question that needs to be asked. The rule would apply whether you're directly participating in hostilities, whether you're in Kiev, in country, in Krakow, the next country over, or in Kansas. The internet enables us to have influence across the globe, and one of the things we can influence and have influenced through the Ukrainian IT volunteer army, people across the world have influenced operations in Ukraine. If you're in Kansas, you're probably not going to be targeted by the Russians. If you're in Kiev, you may be, whether you're participating or not. If you're in Poland, though, you are closer to the danger. And the closer you are to that danger, and you're in the IT community, that's something that I think organizations need to be worried about. I hope I didn't ruin your Saturday. All right, we've got 5 minutes left. Just real quick on Volt Typhoon. And this is more for us as Americans than IT professionals, although certainly it could affect us as well. Basically, the Chinese are alleged to be prepositioning capabilities that could disable our critical infrastructure. The thinking is that if they ever went to war over Taiwan, we wanted to participate, they could make it much more difficult for us to conduct operations in part, but then also make Americans' lives more difficult. The Chinese not only infiltrated critical infrastructure in order to carry out these operations, but also the devices of ordinary American individuals, our routers. A lot of them were Cisco routers, apparently. Anyone from Cisco in here? Good. Yeah, it was a lot of Cisco routers. But they were end of cycle, weren't being updated or whatever. And so when the FBI responded to it, they was like, all right, if we're going to take down the PRC's botnet, we're going to have to go into the devices well, first of all, we're going to have to find which devices they're in, and then we're going to have to do something to affect those devices. What they did successfully was made the botnet essentially kill itself, but they did this on devices that could have been in our homes. So now the government has a proof of concept on and a tool, a technical capability that they can go into Americans' homes who haven't committed any crime, may be completely unaware of how their system is being used, and affecting those systems, deleting code from those systems. That's one thing when it's the PRC or Russia. Everyone knows what I mean by PRC, that's China. It's one thing when it's an intelligence threat or a national security threat, but they can do the same thing for what they consider criminal. And this could include going into certain systems to see if people have visited certain sites, or if they've got a certain application, if certain end-to-end encryption gets outlawed, they would be able to go into the system and determine if we had an application that had end-to-end encryption. So they are now capable. This affects our Fourth Amendment, or implicates our Fourth Amendment rights. There is a mechanism now to do it in law for something like China or Russia on multiple devices, but essentially because of that, the government has scaled it is potentially a surveillance mechanism, but certainly a cyber effects system that could be used at scale. And one of the ways that I think our adversaries defeat us is not just by beating us physically or in cyberspace or however, but also changing our values or the way our values can be carried out. One of the things from the 2016 election cycle is that Russians were accused of trying to influence United States voters. We have a right under the First Amendment, it's not spelled out, but the Supreme Court has found that we have a right to receive information. And it is important that we receive information from foreigners. They can't participate in our elections, but it is important to know what they think about certain issues. How, for example, the Ukrainian war is being carried out and the impact of U.S. support or not supporting them. The people in Ukraine know that best. So hearing information from those Ukrainians, they don't have any First Amendment rights, but we do, and we have a right to hear from them. Whether we have a right to hear from folks who are not genuine about who they are, they're obfuscating who they are, that's in question, but it certainly is not unconstitutional at this point. So it's another thing that as technologists, we're going to be closest to the playing field on how the government can carry out these activities, and they're going to potentially affect what we are used to as the American way of life. One quick thing, since we're out of time, on artificial intelligence. Courts, it appears judges and courts are going to treat it as if it is an employee. So if it does something wrong, it makes a commitment, it makes a statement about what the company will do. If it uses copyrighted materials, so far, it looks like courts are going to treat that as if an employee did it, him or herself. And so you might as well treat your AI capabilities as if they're going to be held accountable like another employee. And it may even be worse than that, because an employee can go a little crazy and do things that are ultra vires, meaning, it's Latin, shouldn't use Latin in a, apologies, that they do something out of the scope of their job. Right, and then the company wouldn't be held liable for what they did. An AI, I don't think it can act ultra vires, again, two Latins. They can't act outside the scope of their job, essentially, because that's what they were built to do. So I would treat any AI tool as an employee in terms of how you're going to be held accountable. So two things to think about as we wrap it up. For any of these issues or any other IT issue, first is that when rules don't seem like they apply, or they may not apply to the situations that technology brings us to that we haven't dealt with before, the thing we always did at Cyber Command was we looked at the underlying values. When the law of armed conflict did not apply to a relatively peaceful operation in cyberspace that wasn't going to kill or hurt everyone, we still thought about damage to civilians or inconvenience to civilians. Didn't mean we had a legal responsibility to avoid certain types of operations that would be inconvenient, but it was certainly something that we thought of because it's one of the values that the law of armed conflict is meant to protect. Other thing I like to do, and this takes a lot of energy, and it was what separated me, I think, as a military lawyer from military commanders. Military commanders focus mainly on an enemy's most likely course of action. What I always did in my job was think about what the worst case scenario was. So I started with the premise that something terrible is going to happen, and my boss is either going to be put in the brig or, even worse, relieved of his job. Starting with that premise, I could work backwards and say, all right, like, what are the things I want to be able to say to whoever investigates this situation? What do I want to be able to say to them that I did now in order to avoid what happened? If all that stuff is reasonable at the time you're making decisions, you know, what you want to avoid is the Monday morning quarterback coming in and say that you didn't think about these issues or you didn't make the right decision with the information that you had at the time. What you want to be able to do is demonstrate, as I was talking about earlier, that you've made reasonable decisions, that you're able to document them, you're able to demonstrate them to your regulators, investigators, and all those. So that's one way to think about these things where we have no roadmap, is to start with that worst case scenario and build backwards and basically say, what is it I would want to be able to demonstrate to whoever's looking at what happened down the road. So it's another thing that's going to take up a lot of time in your jobs, but maybe worthwhile down the road. So we'll only have one more minute, I think. I'm happy to stick around for questions. I think what I'll do is I'll find a way to get the slides. They were beautiful, by the way. Get them to you and then add a little commentary at some point, and maybe even put something on YouTube and discuss a couple of the issues we didn't get to and some of the ones we did. But thank you so much for being here on a Saturday, especially the students. I wasn't even awake by this time when I was a student in college, so on a Saturday. So thank you for being here, and my contact information will be in the slides. Anything y'all ever need, How many folks are from out of town? Okay, so I'm glad that you're here. I'm growing to love the Tampa information technology, cybersecurity community, and getting more integrated with it. And I hope I see all of you on the road a little more often, but I am local and like being part of this team. So see you soon. Thank you for being here.